My name is Grant Swartzwelder, president of OTA Compression and one of the founders of Oilfield Strong webinar series. Very fortunate to have the Permian Basin Petroleum Association as our co-sponsor. Michael Lozano will do the questioning and moderating of today's episode. So I'll turn that over to him shortly. For notice to everyone that all of our presentations, past and present, will be on our YouTube channel. So either go through PBPA or the OTA Compression website or YouTube channel if you want to see any of the previous. Also notice that Chuck Yates, formerly with Kane Anderson, will be our presenter next Wednesday. He always has hot sports opinions on private equity and oil and gas, so it should be very, very interesting. So with that, let me turn it over to Michael to introduce our guest. Representative, thank you for joining us and look forward to hearing your comments. Michael?
Absolutely. I hope everyone can hear me all right. My name is Michael Lozano. I am with the Permian Basin Petroleum Association, and today we have the great fortune of welcoming Representative Brooks Landgraf to this week's webinar. We've got a lot to cover, so I'll try and be brief. I've cut this down to just a few pages of good intro for you. But a native of Odessa, Representative Landgraf is a graduate of Texas A&M University and earned his law degree from St. Mary's University. He was first elected in 2014 to serve Andrews, Ector, Ward, and Winkler counties in the Texas House of Representatives, where he now serves as the Vice Chair of the House Committee on Transportation, a member of the important Business and Industry Committee, and he's recently appointed to the Select Committee on Mass Violence Prevention. Representative Landgraf, thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate having you. How are things in the Permian Basin today?
Well, Michael, thank you for being our host, and also want to thank PBPA. What a wonderful service that y'all continue to provide, and so thank you for helping get this set up. And also want to thank Grant and everybody there at OTA for helping to do this as well. It's a great day in the Permian Basin, as most of our participants know. Of course, we're not without our challenges, but if there's anybody who knows how to be resilient through difficult times, it's the hardworking people in the Permian Basin, and that's one reason why I'm so honored to be able to represent them and serve them in the Texas House of Representatives. But I'm very happy to be with all of you today and look forward to our discussion.
All right, well, let's kick it off. You know, you're right. These certainly have been some very difficult times. I don't think any of us expected the challenges we faced this year. I think we thought $50 oil would be the challenge, perhaps not negative oil and certainly not global pandemic and market destruction. But, you know, with the public health and economic challenges, how are things as you see it for folks in the Permian and for the industry and the communities out there?
Well, you know, Michael, it's a good question. And, you know, if you look at the numbers, the story is pretty bleak. You know, if we can just go back in time a little bit, all the way back to January of 2020, which does seem like a lifetime ago, but the unemployment rate throughout the Permian Basin at the beginning of this year in January was right around 3.4%. Now, well, as recently as July, we're up to 12.6%, which is actually slightly down from peak unemployment back in April when we were almost at 14%. So wow. When you look at those numbers, it's certainly been a negative trend, although we are starting to pick up a little bit. But the difference between January of 2020 pre-pandemic and where we are today is night and day. And of course, the Permian Basin, as everybody on this call knows, was hit with that double whammy back in March, where even before the outbreak really took hold in the United States in mid-March, a few days before that is when the Saudis and the Russians kicked off their price war, which sent crude oil prices down to what was at that time almost a record low. And then of course we certainly surpassed that record later on in April. But that has been a tough time, there's no sugarcoating it. This has been a tough time for the industry. It's been a tough time for the people of the Permian Basin. I would almost argue that it's tougher for us out here in the oil patch than it is for most other parts of the country, which are who are all experiencing challenges. But going back to what we talked about earlier, if there's anybody who's built to be able to withstand this, it's the people of the Permian Basin. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, we have experience weathering these types of storms, maybe not with this exact same complexion, but we do know how to hunker down. We do know how to become more efficient, and we do know how to emerge from a time like this even stronger than we came in. And so in talking with people throughout the Permian Basin in the industry and otherwise, that activity is just below the surface, but it's taking place. And I think that's going to allow us to emerge as strong as ever when the time is right.
Well, and you're like you were saying, this January feels like it was 8 months ago or 10 months ago. It feels like it was 10 years ago. But looking forward, we're only a few months away from next January, which will begin the next legislative session. Are there any big issues that, based on the conversations you've been hearing from your constituents about some of the issues that you want to make your priorities heading into the legislature that meets in just about 120 days?
Well, absolutely. So, Michael, as you know better than anybody, the legislature only convenes every other year for 140 days. And so there always is a backlog of issues. And if there is any policy that needs to be changed via the legislature at the state level, we do have a limited window of time to do that. And so, preparing for these biannual legislative sessions is very important. When it comes to actual energy policy, I might be a little bit biased here, but I believe that Texas does it better than anybody else in the country. And that's thanks in part to the legislature, but also having great leadership at the Texas Railroad Commission, particularly with Christy Craddock and Wayne Christian, who are on now. Of course, Ryan Sitton is going off, and we hope to have to maintain some strong leadership on the commission. But I think between the knowledge, experience, and expertise at the commission and a legacy of pretty good oil and gas policy coming from the legislature, I think we have all of that down pretty well. Now, do we always need to be mindful of changes that are coming down the pike or proposed changes? Absolutely. And we've been doing our homework and are prepared for those. It's part of my job and others in the delegation who represent energy producing areas to make sure that our colleagues from other parts of the state understand and value the importance of the energy and the people who work, in the energy industry and the people who work in the energy industry to the entire state of Texas. And so to me, the challenges, and I guess this is a long way of answering your question, aren't necessarily when it comes to oil and gas policy, but other state issues that manifest in the oil patch. So, for example, where you have oil and gas production, which the Permian Basin is doing better than anybody else and has for quite some time, that does come with it a number of benefits, but it also does create some burdens. Now, do we need those? I mean, do we welcome those? Yes, because it means that we have so much activity and we're doing our job for the state. But what comes to mind is you have a lot of commercial vehicles, for example. So you have a lot of deterioration of public highways, of state highways, of interstate highways, of county roads. And so maintaining our infrastructure is important. Now, that's important for two reasons. One is it allows the flow of commerce. It allows the industry to be able to do its job in the oil patch. But keep in mind that we have hundreds of thousands of people who live and work in the oil patch, and it's a quality of life issue for them as well. It's a public safety issue for people inside and outside of the industry. So making sure that the state is investing in transportation infrastructure has been a priority. We've had some success, but there's more work to do. And a lot of people say, well, look, activity has decreased a little bit. That need is not there. But those of us in the Permian Basin and people who have been through this before across the state know that it's just a matter of time before we come back. And actually, a slower period like this is actually a wonderful opportunity to make those investments, make those improvements so that we're ready to go when production comes back. And it's only a matter of time before demand for energy returns on a global scale. And when that happens, people across the world are going to be looking to the Permian Basin to supply those energy needs. And so this is a good time to invest. I know I mentioned and focused on transportation policy and transportation infrastructure, but the same story can be told when it comes to overcrowded public schools, when it comes to overcrowded hospitals. oil and gas production brings with it a lot of people, and not everybody is working in the industry, but they're bringing families. They have healthcare needs, and so we need to make sure that we're investing in transportation, in public education, in healthcare, and in other areas that are very important, not only from an industry perspective, but for a quality of life, from a quality of life perspective. And one way that we've looked at doing that is through the Grow Texas Fund, and that's something that Speaker Tom Craddock and I, our dean, not only of the Permian Basin delegation, but of the entire Texas House of Representatives, and we both represent the Permian Basin, and so that's something that we worked on last session. Actually made quite a bit of headway on that issue, but that's something that we're looking to doing in the upcoming session, and I look forward to working under Speaker Craddock and his leadership to help address these issues the best way that we can under what will undoubtedly be very difficult circumstances.
You know, you're not wrong. I think you mentioned a couple of different things, and I think that it's a really good assessment. One of the biggest challenges our industry, looked at was ensuring some consistency in the regulatory framework, especially given the changes in the pandemic, and helping to pivot from some of those challenges. And I think also looking forward, it's long-term investment on really important critical infrastructure like you're describing in the roads and the schools, the hospitals, and of course, even things like, electric transmission and broadband services. All of those things are things I think the community is looking for and needing in these times. And you're right, last session, a big priority that you shared with us was your interest in securing, long-term funding for important infrastructure needs. And you talked about the GROW effort last session. Can you describe functionally how legislation like that works in order to accomplish the goals you're outlining, and what your goals are with that in mind heading into the next session?
Sure. Well, not to get too specific, because we want to make sure that, whatever it is proposed, that it's, we want to be successful with whatever we do. But generally speaking, the idea is not to raise taxes to do this. I believe that we have the resources available, and we've actually always had it. It's really just prioritizing the way that we actually distribute the benefits that the oil and gas industry already produces. Michael, better than anybody else, and most folks on this meeting are aware too, but the oil and gas industry produces and has produced billions upon billions of dollars in tax revenue for the state. And one area that's very specific for that is oil and gas severance tax, which is the production tax that the state of Texas has levied on oil and gas production for decades now. Now, that money is generally spent in three ways. Part of it goes to the State Highway Fund, part of it goes to the Permanent School Fund, but a very large chunk goes to the Economic Stabilization Fund, which most of us refer to as the Rainy Day Fund. Now, that Rainy Day Fund, which is very well known across Texas and has, especially in recent years, been a very robust piggy bank for the state of Texas, is funded entirely through the oil and gas severance tax. So that money is entirely thanks to the oil and gas industry. Now, it has in various ways helped the entire state of Texas, and that's good. That's its primary purpose, and I want that to continue to be the case. But when times resume, or when normal times resume, and things economically, get back to where they are, if that rainy day fund has a very sufficient balance to make sure that we maintain a very high bond rating, which typically we have, in the needs of the state are adequately being met, instead of just continuing to add to that fund, which actually is not, at this point in time, it doesn't even really bear interest. I mean, it's absolutely good to have, but I think that we can be smarter and more strategic about using that. And I think we can also dedicate a portion of the oil and gas severance tax that goes to the rainy day fund and put it to a higher use that can have a more immediate impact for the people of Texas. And I think one way to do that, and again, this kind of the idea that we've talked about and we've presented before, is to take a very modest percentage of that oil and gas severance tax revenue and reinvest it in the energy producing areas of the state, so that there aren't any shortcomings when it comes to the transportation infrastructure in the oil patch, and so that there are enough workforce training opportunities, educational opportunities, healthcare opportunities, and yes, broadband and other connectivity issues in the oil patch so that it can be not only a good place for us to produce oil, but Michael, as you have said before, so that it can be a good place to live, work, and raise a family. And we just want to take care of the whole picture, because if that's happening in places like the Permian Basin, and quite honestly, in places like the Eagle Ford Shale or any other place in the state that produces oil and gas, if we want to keep that going, if we want to continue to fuel the Texas miracle, that has to be a safe, those energy producing areas have to be safe places to do that, and places that are conducive to having all of the many components that it takes to produce oil and gas. And so by reinvesting a very modest percentage of that tax revenue back into those regions, I think that we can do that. And that is a very good investment. I think it's a smart investment for the people of Texas to make for our continued long-term prosperity.
Absolutely. And I think that was one of the reasons why I think our members were so supportive of the concept, last session, and even more so, I think people are very surprised, like perhaps we were, we maybe a little more focused on the large amounts being produced in the Permian, and we're a little parochial, sure, given the regional nature of our association. But, we were surprised to learn that I think it was something like 220 out of the 254 counties have some measurable amount of oil production. And so it's not as narrowly unique to the region as we all think of. Granted, 80% of all the production right now is likely in the Permian, but it's still a huge industry occurring across the state, and I think we need to be mindful of that and its impact in those areas as well. So I think that's important. And on the transportation front, you've been very involved as the vice chairman of the Transportation Committee, and involved with TxDOT commission hearings as well. And recently we saw that there was some bill grant funding from the U.S. Department of Transportation for I-20. And then TxDOT has also agreed in the UTP to invest some long-term funding dollars. And you've been outspoken in your support for these issues. Can you describe your issues during the interim, your support of those issues in the interim, and kind of out some of that for our members?
Absolutely. When I talk with people who work in the oil patch, for the people that I serve, that I work with and interact with on a daily basis, and Michael, you know this too, because you hear the same things, and so do the member companies of PBPA. But the most dangerous place to work in the oil patch is not on a rig. It's not hauling pipe or anything like that. It is actually being on the highways, getting to the job site or to work from your home. That's the most dangerous part of the day for anybody who's working in the industry, or the most dangerous part of the day for anybody who just happens to be in the Permian Basin at any given time. And so those transportation needs are absolutely critical. And so that's why, when we were just talking a few minutes ago about the Grow Texas Fund, that's why transportation is such a big component of that. Now, of course, a plan like that, or severance tax dollars, is not the only way to invest in our transportation infrastructure. And that's why we've been working so diligently, and it's been a delegation-wide effort. Speaker Craddock's been very helpful with this, but organizations like PBPA have been very helpful as well. And I want to thank you and Ben Shepard and your member companies for doing this. It's been an all-hands-on-deck approach, and we've had so many people from the Permian Basin who have been spending time with transportation commissioners on making sure that these needs are accounted for in the UTP, that our voice is being heard in Washington with the U.S. Department of Transportation when it comes to the allocation of build grant funds. And so, and those efforts have paid off. And I think part of it has been telling the story that as goes the Permian Basin, so goes Texas. And we have to make the investments, the necessary investments in our infrastructure, if we want to keep this going. Oil and gas production doesn't just happen by accident, and just because you may not have to see it every day, or maybe if you don't work in that realm, doesn't mean that there's not a whole lot that goes into it. And so making sure that we have in the Unified Transportation Program, the UTP, which is TxDOT's 10-year plan, making sure that we have projects accounted for, that's critically important. And just to be very specific about this, last year when the UTP was presented and voted on by the Transportation Commissioners at the end of August of 2019, the Odessa TxDOT district, which encompasses 12 counties, that basically covers most of the Permian Basin, Ector County, Midland County, and then parts, primarily west and south. But in the heart of the Permian Basin, we received record funding because of the efforts that we were making that, look, the oil patch has to be taken care of. We blew past that record again this year when $2.5 billion were announced in that UTP for the energy producing areas, most notably in the 12 county Odessa TxDOT region. We're making that case. That case is being heard, and I'm very thankful for everybody who's helped to make that case, and very thankful to the transportation commissioners and the team at TxDOT for recognizing that. Because when oil and gas produces so much of the revenue that pays for freeway, these massive freeway projects in Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, you don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden egg. And I think that's finally starting to get through to my colleagues and other policymakers across the state that we have to take care of energy producing areas if we want the Texas economy as we know it to be sustainable. And so that's working. And then, as you mentioned, Michael, that message is being heard all the way up in Washington when I guess it was last week, a $25 million build grant was awarded after TxDOT applied for it to redo an overpass on Interstate 20 in Midland County at Cotton Flats Road, which is kind of famous for being the most frequently struck overpass probably in the entire state of Texas, just because we have so many overheight loads that go through there. That overpass is too low for modern specs and modern standards. But that just shows that as the industry evolves, our infrastructure has to evolve. And that grant, to me, it's obviously $25 million goes a long way. It's very important. But to me, there's a lot of symbolism in that being awarded because it recognizes that there are tremendous needs to be met in the Permian Basin. And it's important for everybody, including at the federal level, to put our money where our mouth is to make those investments if we're going to sustain long-term economic success.
Absolutely. I think, there's a really good understanding about if you're going to be pro-energy, you have to be pro-energy infrastructure as well. And I think along with your support in the delegation with Speaker Craddock, as well as Senator Cornyn and Congressman Conway were really instrumental and y'all were instrumental in convincing Secretary Chow and the USDOT to award that build grant to TxDOT, who's done great work. And I think folks would be surprised just to learn how expensive these projects are. On the cheap end, we're talking about $1 million a lane mile, $25 million for an overpass. And so these are large amounts of money that take great investment. And I think you're right that it's great to finally see some movement in that direction and the symbolism of that.
Right.
And talking about convincing some of your colleagues and working within the legislature, this is certainly a different look heading into the session. For those of you that don't know, the Capitol complex is closed to the public. That includes the grounds as well. So kind of to that end, how do you and your colleagues foresee the session kind of functionally working next year? Do you have any insight as to the building being open or what we can expect?
Sure. And before I get to that, and I'm
Sure.
happy to address that, let me go back because I just realized I didn't really talk very much about other specifics other than the Cotton Flat Road. But, when you're talking about $2.5 billion, if I were listening to this and hearing about it for the first time, I'd want to know where that money's going. So let me just
Sure.
very briefly talk about where that's going to be invested. These thoroughfares have been studied, and look, it doesn't take a traffic engineer to know where we need help, where we need assistance. Interstate 20 in Midland County and Ector County has some critical needs that need to be met. The lion's share of the money that we're talking about is going to be invested in I-20 with the idea of making it a 6-lane freeway, 3 lanes in each direction, and reconfiguring frontage roads and overpasses to make it a much safer interstate, but also to significantly increase the traffic capacity in these very congested, highly traveled areas. But also the Loop 250 around the city of Midland, Loop 338 around the city of Odessa will see significant improvements. Also Highway 18 and then very critically Highway 302 in between Odessa, Midland, which is the heart of the Permian Basin, and west, that connects west to the heart of the Delaware Basin. It's in most stretches a 2-lane highway that needs to be a 4-lane highway, and we have a lot of quite a bit of focus on that. So not to mention Highway 285 in Reeves County, which connects Interstate 20 through Pecos with the Delaware Basin. So all of these areas where safety is an issue and capacity is an issue, that's where so much of the focus is going. But anyway, I wanted to specify that because $2.5 billion doesn't do you any good unless you know exactly where it's going. So, but shifting gears, your question is great about what's the world going to look like at the Texas Capitol when the legislature convenes in January. Short answer is we don't know exactly yet. There are first of all, we don't have the membership of the House set yet, and so that's going to be one issue. And that may have some influence on some of the decisions that are made. But regardless of how it looks, in my view, and the view of so many colleagues that I've spoken with, transparency has to be key. As we talked about earlier, the legislature doesn't meet very often. For 20 weeks every other year, that's when most of the business of the state of Texas gets decided on, and that system doesn't work very well unless you have transparency and you have input from the public, because it's their government after all. And having a situation where we make big decisions, but the doors are closed in the discussion of those decisions, I think that's something that we have to do everything possible to avoid. And if that means, throttling back how much business actually is done or taken care of, that may be a way to go. But obviously there are big decisions that need to be prioritized, and I think we have to do that. But let's focus on what's most important and allow the public and allow some sunshine to be involved in that process, because I think that's how we get the best outcomes, and that's how you get the most legitimate outcomes. So with that, also with that being in mind, we do have some vulnerable members of the House, just in terms of either pre-existing health conditions or anything like that. And that's going to be true for members of the public who want to be involved in the process. And so we need to make sure that that's accounted for. It should be, the Capitol should be safe, no question about that. And we have to go to, the lengths necessary to make sure that it's safe for the public, but it does need to be accessible to the public if big decisions are going to be made on their behalf. So that's just my personal opinion. But hopefully we'll get to a point where we're seeing something like that. But the public has to be involved. There has to be transparency in the process, and we just need to do everything that we can to make that happen in a safe way.
Well, as a bit of an aside, looking back at the House Journal from 1919, there was some interesting methods being used to air the building out overnight. After a certain hour, members had to leave. The building was aired out, given that it was pushed air anyway. But there were some interesting things. So at the very least, at least we're not struggling with the same type of technology available to predecessors in 1919. This is a little bit different in the last plague, I guess we'll say. But kind of going off of that, in our one of the biggest issues we do have is our advocacy. We work with the legislature, and I think you're right. While the Permian Basin, you have a great statistic you always mention about how few members there are west of 35, not including El Paso. But it's about telling everyone the story about the Permian Basin, and I think the industry does share concerns that while the state, all throughout the state, has greatly benefited from the funding that's been derived from the oil and gas industry, especially in rural areas of the state, there seems to be a disconnect between lawmakers that are willing to support the industry because of public perception. How can we help members like you, who are great advocates for us, to recognize this industry, and how can we become better advocates to your colleagues?
Well, I think it comes down to the economy, and it comes down to just making sure that our story is told. And unfortunately, there are all too many people, and historically it's been outside of Texas, but you've had folks on the coasts, take any opportunity that they can to bash the oil and gas industry and highlight whatever negatives they perceive to be about it, or having fossil fuels at all. Obviously, we know the other side of that equation. We know the other side of that story, and that's the story that we have to continue to tell. But for example, when Speaker Crack and I were rounding up votes for Grow Texas on the floor, we were able to tell that story, and it was very well received. And let me just elaborate on that a little bit. And going back to what you mentioned in the question, yes, the numbers are not on our side. And I'm sorry that you've heard me say it so many times, but
I like it.
there are 150 members of the Texas House of Representatives. Of those 150, there are only 16 of us who represent the swath of Texas west of I-35 to the El Paso County line. So, I mean, more than half.
Panhandle to the Red River.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. From the Rio Grande to the Red River. So 16 of us out of 150, which as even an Aggie like me can figure out that's not enough by yourself to get anything passed in a body of 150 people. So we do have to tell that story. But one way that we were able to do it is we went to members of the Harris County delegation where Houston is. By contrast, so again, we have 16 in all of West Texas. Harris County alone has 26 members of the Texas House of Representatives. So they outnumber us in that one county. Now, I mentioned Houston for a reason, because in having conversations with members from Harris County, some of whom represent refineries or petrochemical complexes, or who represent constituents who work at the corporate headquarters for a lot of companies that are doing business in the Permian Basin, we would make the case that, look, how much of the economic activity in Houston, whether it's in the high rises in downtown or at a refinery in Baytown, how much of that is sourced from the Permian Basin? And of course, when you couch it in those terms, the answer is pretty clear, that Houston wouldn't be Houston without what's going on upstream in the Permian Basin. And so if you want that benefit to continue to flow down to Houston, or flow to Dallas or San Antonio or any other major metropolitan area, you have to take care of the source of that wealth. And so, once we had a conversation like that, it was a pretty short discussion about how important it is to support the Permian Basin, how important it is to invest in the Permian Basin. But when you put it in economic terms that are pretty clear, it makes it a pretty convincing case, and we just have to continue to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The downtown to Baytown isn't exactly a really good representation of the importance of the upstream industry in the Permian to those communities over there. Just to kind of give us the 30,000-foot view. I know we're kind of running short and your time is valuable, so I don't want to waste it. But this session was already focused on being a challenge, given redistricting, given the budget challenges because of the pandemic and sales tax reductions and severance tax declines. And perhaps maybe even a narrowing of the partisan divide. But are there any forecasts that you have for the 87th legislature that you want to share with our members before we kind of finish off? Or
No, I'll be happy to. So this will be my fourth session as a member of the Texas House of Representatives, and I can say right now, 4 months out, that it will be by far the most challenging that I've ever been a part of. You're absolutely right. We are not going to have very much money. We'll have probably less revenue coming in than as we write the state's budget. We are going to have redistricting because of new census data that's coming out, and we're constitutionally obligated to redraw House districts for the State House, the State Senate, as well as for Texas's congressional delegation. And as you might imagine, and if history is any precedent, that can be an acrimonious process. And a highly politicized process that kind of bleeds over into some of the other policy discussions that we have. So, and you're right, the partisan divide in the House may become a little bit closer. And so 4 months out, it looks like there's this perfect storm, this confluence of events that's taking place to make it a very difficult and challenging session. And so I'm under no illusions that this will be difficult for all of those reasons, and probably a few more that will materialize between now and then. But the way that I'm trying to approach that is, hey, look, let's simplify. Let's focus on what's most important. Let's make sure that while we're not going to be able to snap our fingers and at the end of this legislative session make Texas look exactly the way that we want it to. So let's not pretend that that's even a possibility, but instead let's focus on what's most important. Let's make sure that we're spending the money that we do have in a smart way. Let's make sure that we're investing in the long-term things that are going to be important, whether it is transportation infrastructure, whether it's public education. Let's take care of the first things first, and then and just do everything that we can to set ourselves up for future success later on, because I don't think that we're going to get everything that we want to get done in 2021. So let's do everything we can to move the ball forward and set ourselves up to be in a good position in 2023 when the legislature convenes next.
Well, I think that's absolutely fair. And, you know better than most that the issues we talk about in November are rarely the issues we talk about in January. And those are very rarely the issues we're talking about in May. And even if there are some special ones in the summer. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And is there anything you'd like to add before we close off today?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to visit with y'all, and no, thank you. And if there's anything that I can do to help better prepare and to make sure that our voices are heard in this legislative session coming up, please let me know. We'll have plenty of work to do, but I can do a better job as a state representative when I'm hearing from folks like y'all on this call. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And Michael, if you would, please feel free to share my contact info with everybody.
Absolutely. Anyone, if you have any questions for the representative, please let me know, and I'll be happy to pass that along. And before we go, I just want to add one last plug. Our annual meeting will be taking place in about 14 days. We look forward to hosting this fully virtual event that will include messages from Governor Greg Abbott, Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, and a panel discussion with the two longest serving legislators in Texas history, which include former Speaker Tom Craddock of Midland and Chairwoman Senfronia Thompson of Houston. We expect this to be a wide range of perspectives to be shared during this unprecedented time. And we expect broad participation and substantive discussions about the challenges in the industry and the region today, as well as the opportunities that exist moving forward. The event will also include some great analysis from noted author Robert Bryce and economic forecasting from Bobby Tudor of Tudor, Pickering, Holt & Company. Registration and sponsorships are now available, and if you have any more information or want to reach out, please let me know, and we're happy to answer them. Representative Landgraf, thank you again for joining us today, and we really appreciate your support of the industry and absolutely your willingness to go to great lengths to represent your community in the Permian Basin. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Proud to be in the fight. Thank y'all.
Bye, everyone. Have a good day.